just quick introduction for Andy. As you can see here on the screen, Andy is the chairman of the board and chief partnership officer at Othot. And Othot is a fairly new company, right, Andy? That you guys have been around a year or two and focus
6 years.
on 6 years now. Sorry, seems like shorter than
Time
that.
flies.
Relatively new, right? So you guys are focused on artificial intelligence and prescriptive analytics, specifically in higher education. And I actually know your CEO, Fred Weiss. He and I go way back. So I don't have further background on you, Andy, but I'm going to turn over to you to run the session, and appreciate you taking the time to do that today. So starting the timer now.
Great. Thank you very much, David. And thank you, Matt. Thanks to be on. Just fantastic to be here and be part of this this experience, and looking forward to sharing some of what we're doing at Othot, but mostly just some thought leadership around getting to data and the use of data and knowledge. And that's really where I want to start this. I have a personal philosophy that I'd like to convey, which is with time and knowledge, we can capture opportunities and solve problems. And the reason why I start there is because the beginning of my presentation is going to have some highlights on some challenges that we're facing. And as I talk to my colleagues across the country, as I talk to presidents and provosts and vice presidents, and we talk about what are the objectives for the 2020s. And the 2020s, for the most part, most institutions are talking about growth, whether it's growth in programs or it's growth in students, number of students, or it's growth in NTR. That is a major theme, and rightly so. But related to that, growth is great, but we can't ignore birth rates. And that's why I wanted to start here, and I wanted to start with a little bit of the challenge. And we see a lot of data that's out there and a lot of studies that talk about a huge decline that's going to happen at 2025. And so we've used a number of data sources, and we've looked at the challenge. And there is no mistake about it. You can't avoid birth rate. So we're almost 17 years since the financial crisis. And what happens at that time is those birth rates start to sink. But it's not just a national story. And sometimes what data and analytics allows us to do is to drive to the individual, whether it's the individual institution or the individual who attends our institution. So as we started working with our partners and some other universities across the country, we looked at it from a regional basis. And when you look at it from a regional basis, it's a different story in New England than it is in the Southwest. Right, so there are different demographics and different population changes that are at play. But then as you continue to dive deeper and you look at the individual states where universities and colleges are recruiting, you can see another challenge, because certain states have lower growth rates of those first-time students that we should expect in 2025. And then if we look at the number of competitive colleges that are in our geographic area, and we look at schools who may have significant resources and they may have a brand that's stronger, that's going to drive our growth rate lower. And by the way, borders are no longer, they're no longer a defense, because we have schools that are crossing borders and recruiting. So depending on your individual institution, it could be as much as double or 2.5 times the negative growth rate of the supply of first-time students that you're typically used to recruiting from. There's two things I want to point out that are really critical in what I said, though. It's 25 to 28 is when that decline is going to happen, which means that we have time. And we can drive it down to the individual institution, which means that we have knowledge. So that knowledge and time can help us capture the opportunity, or in some cases, solve problems. Now, I'm not foreshadowing an apocalyptic future, but I just want to highlight that we can't ignore birth rates and changing demographics and the competitive actions of other schools who are coming into our geographies. And so I want to start there, and I want to say it comes to the individual institution. And we need to ask ourselves, who is our ideal student? Where are they, and how do we attract them? And we can say, based off of those birth rates that I was talking about and the supply of first-time students, that without change, our fate can be determined. If we continue to think just about our geography and where we recruit, we're going to end up in a situation where we're going to have a decline in our number of students. And so change is critical. I want to use an example from the retail industry that everybody's familiar with, which is Amazon as compared to Sears. If you think about how Sears started back in 1880, they were a catalog company. You took the catalog, you looked up a product, you sent a check in the mail to Sears. Sears put on a Wells Fargo wagon, and it got delivered to your doorstep. Think about what I just said. You order it, send the money, and it gets delivered to your doorstep. Effectively, Sears back in the 1880s was the Amazon of the day. Amazon, of course, has been the digital native retail giant that has captured most of the market share in that Sears had once had. Sears is no longer around. Amazon is the main player. This is not to say that there is a foregone conclusion that that's where you're going to end up. It means that we need to use technology to position ourselves to be in a competitive situation. So Amazon's secret to success, of course, is analytics. They are the most analytic company on the planet, and they understand how to drive down into the individual and understand the individual's behavior. And that's what we need to start to think about when we think about how we're attracting students, is how do we get to know them en masse the day that we meet them. It's not saying that geography isn't important. What it's saying is that we got to look beyond geography. I want to use one more example from industry, and that is that we can look at we can look at a sales funnel. And in a traditional sales funnel, we all have enrollment funnels as well. And in a traditional sales funnel, what we see is that it's highly dependent on time and a sequential process. So how long we've known a customer, what stage of the process they're in, what the likely contract value is. We multiply all that together, and that tells us what our sales forecast is. It's a function of time in a sequential process. What we should be looking at, however, is the likelihood of an individual to buy, or in our case, the likelihood of an individual to enroll in a university. We can know that based off of data immediately when we meet the person. We can gather data and have an idea of how they fit with our organization. And so we should be thinking about using technology, about learning about the individual at a very deep level, but we should also be looking at how we can see their fit related to our institution. So we can pay more attention when we know, even from the day that we meet them, their likelihood to enroll. We can pay more attention to them. We can allocate more resources to them. And we're very, very lucky in higher ed, because once the students come out of stealth mode, we know more about them than any other company or organization knows about their prospective customer or their prospective student in our case. So again, we're in a very fortunate situation to use the technology and the tools that are available to us. I want to show you a picture of how we think multidimensionally about the individual institution. What you see here is two charts. And on the horizontal axis of both charts are growth rates from 2025 to 2028. So if you remember from that first graph, that goes from 0 to -13 on this graph. So that's your negative growth rates of the supply of first-time students that relate to your institution. We can use predictive analytics to understand, based off of where you recruit and how you recruit, if you do nothing different than what you are doing today, what will your growth rate be between 2025 and 2028? Now look at that left-hand graph. That left-hand graph at the bottom left, first of all, on the vertical axis, we have the growth rates from 20 to 25. So we're looking at the growth rates of 2025 versus 25 to 28. If you're in that bottom left-hand corner, you have very small growth rates over the next 5 years. You have very negative growth rates from 25 to 28. And the darkness of that circle tells you how concentrated you are in a particular geography. So if you're a dark circle in that bottom left-hand corner, you need to think differently and boldly about your strategy. Take a look at the right one. The one on the right, again, on the horizontal, is that growth rate from 25 to 28. On that vertical axis, that's the retention rate. So lower the retention. So that yellow corner that you see is lower retention rates and very negative growth rates. You might immediately think, well, that's trouble, but that's actually opportunity. It shows you the importance of retention, right? We need to look at retention in a very strategic way when you're in a position where your growth rates are going to shrink. And this can be done on an individual school by individual school basis. So today we have the knowledge, and most of us have the time to be able to understand where we are, and we can develop strategy to future-proof our organization. So what does it mean to future-proof your organization? Number one, it's to protect and engage, right? Looking at that multi-dimensionality of the predictions of where your school will be if you do nothing different, and we're subject to those growth rates that I talked about. We need to make sure that we're strong with our recruitment and retention and protecting our geography. It's not meant to say ignore geography. It means that we need to get beyond it. All of our schools, every school exists because, you have assets, you have programs that are your shining stars. They're the reasons why students seek out your institution. We need to make sure that that isn't just known to the individuals in our geography, but we can look across the country. We can look at potential students that may be 3, 4, 5 states away, but they match what we teach and what we're good at. And if we're able to do that, if we're able to put our brand on what we're good at, that brand will resonate all the way across the nation. And I think we heard this in the first 2 talks as well. Future work is critical. We need to make sure that we're matching future work, the placement of the individuals, the outcomes, to what our programs are. And if we match those programs to the student, we're going to have a seamless stream of students who are going to enroll and be successful and graduate and get a great job. And we need to think about this because geography is not as big of a barrier as it used to be. Even though you may be sitting there thinking, well, I'm still going to protect my geography. Living in Pittsburgh, the number of television and radio ads from Arizona State University is amazing. So there's a whole complete change from a competitive aspect that we need to think about how to move beyond that geography and realize that virtual students are the new normal. Not saying that we're going to go completely virtual, but there will be an aspect of virtual education that will continue well beyond the pandemic. So now I want to talk a little bit about how do we make this happen, right? So these are big picture concepts that make logical sense. And when we think about it in the context of the changing demographics and the supply of first-time students, we have to ask ourselves, how do we prepare? How do we change the institution? And what advanced analytics and AI allows us to do is to understand deeply an individual from the day that we meet them in high school to the day that they enroll through their experience at the university, helping them get great jobs and then be active alumni. It's a continuum of data and analytics on one platform. We need to understand that continuum every step of the way. And when we understand that continuum, we can enroll the best fit students at the right price who are going to persist, get a great job with the least amount of debt, and remain active alumni and continue to give back in terms of time, treasure, and talent to the university. We have to understand that these students, this generation of students that are entering into university, have been taught by Amazon, Netflix, Spotify, TikTok, Instagram, that the world is a personal place, that everything comes to them personalized. They think about data and experiences very differently than any other generation. They expect a personalized education. They expect to understand where they're going to get a job or be placed once they graduate. And you can't do that unless you have this deep understanding of the individual from the day that we meet them until the days that they're active alumni. And I would say that most institutions have a vision of lifelong learning, of lifelong relationships with their alumni. We can't really serve that constituent unless we've understood the journey that they've been on from the very beginning. This is why those companies that I mentioned, or the students are interacting with, the Amazons and Netflix, the et ceteras, they understand analytics and people at a very, very deep level. So when we do that, when we have that continuum, when we have that single pane of glass to be able to understand the individual, we can then use that information to optimize the outcomes for a student. We can say, we can help them understand what their passion is. We heard that earlier, what their outcome that they want to be, and help them, nudge them into the experience that are going to increase, maximize the probability that they're going to be successful. When we use predictive and diagnostic analytics to understand where our individual institution is related to growth rates and retention rates and concentration, we can then set our strategy of what we need to do to grow. And that has to come from a reimagination of who we are. We have to understand what are the assets that we have. What are the programs, the professors, the experiences, the outcomes that we have that will resonate to the student regardless of their geography, and so that we can serve them in the best way possible. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy. Come back on here. So we don't have any questions submitted yet. Please, if you're in the audience, use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and feel free to type in questions. Here comes a question now. So this is a long one. I'm going to read this to you, Andy. Here we go.
Okay.
Doesn't Google entry into reasonably priced online education with certifications that are already recognized by a number of large institutions play into the lifelong learner model and pose a serious threat to higher ed revenues as well? I assume the metrics of these slides are not included the impact it can have on our institutions. The competition for students has been disrupted. Much like another industry where in order to survive, banks must look like tech firms because tech firms already look like the banks, such as Venmo, Apple Pay, Google Pay, etc., school doesn't have to have the brick and mortar or the tech silos to handicap us financially to deal with. Does that make sense, Andy?
Well, that is a lot. There's no doubt about it. So I could take that question, that comment from a number of different angles. I think absolutely, first of all, that competition is going to come from numerous angles, and the numbers that I showed and the analysis that I showed are primarily related to growth, the same share of students going into to colleges and universities once they graduate from high school. So that could be another pressure that reduces down the or increases the negative growth rates that you might experience. So it heightens the awareness of what we need to do. The infrastructure that's been built is absolutely a really interesting point. And in fact, if we look at what Sears did, if we go back to the example that I had earlier, that Sears, they transitioned from that mail order catalog system to a brick and mortar and distribution system of the mall because of the technology called the automobile. So they were able to transition from one business model to the next. But what made them successful in that transition to the mall actually hindered their ability to transition to be a digitally oriented retailer. And so that is a cautionary tale that we need to make sure that we understand that maybe some of the systems and structures and the infrastructure that we built is going to make it a big challenge for us to transition to a digital world. And then the last thing I'll say is the only way that we can continue to have that deep relationship with the individual is to try and mimic the Amazon experience with the retailer as close as possible, which is understand the individual and their behavior. And that's why you need to have a system or some type of platform that allows you to digitally understand the behaviors and the desires, the passions of the individual, and maintain as much of that market as you can. So David, an equally long answer for a long question or a comment, but hopefully that hits the mark.
Andy, I have a question, and it really goes back to, and as you know, Beyond is built off of what we call future of work and future of learning, right? Our firm is built on rethinking how organizations, universities, and industries are going to rethink what they do. So you just gave a great example around Sears, right? They had to think about the transformation when they realized the automobile is going to be the method and the way people come, right? And if we just think about, Amazon coming into the world, right? So when we think about future of work, and I'm working with a bunch of different innovative universities around future work, they have to first align with industry, because industry is what will influence the transformation within the curriculum or the offerings, right? How does a university or a college, when they're thinking about future of work, use the data that we have? Because remember, data is power at these universities. I don't think they realize the powerful element of what sits on their platforms, right? It's data. How do you harness it? How do you start to integrate it with industry? Like, how do we start to recognize that this student that we taught and then went into industry, and then they came back and relearned something? Maybe they went to an innovation hub or one of the centers, right? And then they got a new job. Like, how do we track that type of world? This goes a little bit to my enrollment DNA world that me and you talk about.
Sure. Yep.
And there'll be another session. But I would love you to talk about future of work and what this means and why data is so important, because the world is changing around us.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Matt. And I'm actually going to answer it from two angles. The first one is the student. So the student is the future worker, right? So that number one is we need to understand, what does the student want to achieve and through their journey at the university, and where do they want to end up upon placement? And what we're working with a couple of universities, which I think is really cool, is one of them is, so if a student knows what they want to be, let's say they want to be a Big Four accountant, right? So we know that there's a market for that, and the university has sent hundreds of thousands of people to that end and a big four accountant over many years. What data and analytics can tell us is what is the best path for that individual student to take to maximize the chances that they're going to be a big four accountant. What's even cooler than that is most students don't know what they want to do, right? So imagine that what the platform can tell you is they can say, you can press a button, you can say, here's who I am. Here's the classes I've taken, here's the grades, here's what I like to do, here's the types of organizations I'm involved with. And the platform all of a sudden says, oh, here's 10 pathways of students who came before you who are like you and where they ended up. All of a sudden, I have a vision for where I want to go. And now I'm engaged. Now I graduate sooner. Now I get a great job. So that's the student angle of it. The university angle of it, which we have one visionary university that we work with that's sort of on that path, but they say, what I want to do is understand, there's a particular industry, a couple industries that they love. What are they looking for in the next generation of students? And so if I can take those attributes and I can put them at the end of the process as an outcome, I can now combine those two things and make sure that my students are learning what they need to learn to be able to hit those outcomes of future work. So that's the vision, which, you know, Matt, you asked this question because you know how passionate I am about this, but that's what I think when you really get to the power of individual analytics and AI, that's what we can do for students and that's what we can do for future work.
So, and there's a bunch of other questions and we're going to get to each one of them, but I just want to make this statement. You know, we've gamified a little bit of what we're doing in the summit for our thought leaders and their respective companies. Othot is leading in the number of clicks that we have gotten on our website on this on the summit. So there are 1,073. They're in the lead. We got a day, and we'll see if others will come in. Got 73 of those that registered through your links, and you just took over Salesforce in the number of participants attending today's session. So you're at 125. You were hit 126 just a minute ago. So now you're leading that. So just want to say thank you for all the promotion.
Well,
and
no,
David,
don't thank me. Don't thank me. That's our incredible marketing team. And you know, being a digitally native company, I'm so proud of them. But thank you for mentioning that.
Yes, awesome. David, there's a bunch of other questions. I wanted to. Yeah,
we've got 6 minutes left, and I'll just comment as well, Andy. I think the holy grail has been, you know, figuring out how to really understand that student and continue to understand that student as they become an alumnus of the institution, right? That's kind of I grew up in advancement. That's my background, and that's everyone's trying to figure that out. So I think the analytics, the data here are critical to being able to better align with industry and also to better understand our students and alumni, for sure. The next question I have here is, how do institutions make sure their faculty stays up to date to teach lifelong learners? Faculty stay in the same institution for 20+ years and teach professional development, and often professional development for faculty is not supported. Any thoughts on that topic?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting way to think about using the data. If we're learning about the progression that our alumni are having in their careers in life and what it is that they want to learn, a lot of this is that we have to understand what organizations are looking for and what individuals want to learn. There has to be a feedback loop. So that data and information gives us the opportunity to create what we'll call prescriptions, right? So that the alumni will remain more engaged if they're participating in a particular event, or they learn or go to a particular education session, or they're learning a particular topic. Like analytics is a great example, and you know, University of Pittsburgh is doing a great job with that. So that feedback loop, though, those prescriptions, if you don't have the content, if you don't have the skills or the knowledge within your organization, it allows you to say, this is what our alumni are looking for as lifelong learners. And so how do we build the programs and how do we build up the faculty to be able to deliver what's necessary to keep them as lifelong learners, and perhaps fend off, Google or LinkedIn or, so that we can maintain that relationship with the alumni.
Great. Another question here. The question is, and this is a question that I've been thinking about a lot myself, how do we go beyond just retention? So we look at our students, we get them to graduate, but going beyond that, using data analytics to identify how we can tailor services after they graduate. Are they going to leave our geographic reason, for example, like leave the area? Or are they going to stay in the area and get back to the local economy? Is one example. Any thoughts on kind of postgraduate success?
Yeah. I mean, so a lot of schools will do surveys, periodically, of course. And one of the things that we have to get much better at is using much more modern techniques of understanding individuals and sentiments and what they're learning and what they're experiencing. And so there's a great CMU spin out called Civic Science, who knows how to put questions out there in a very digital and social media oriented way, gather that information and analyze it. And so we have to be able to be in a sort of a constant communication that's not, I would say, intrusive, so that we're able to get that insights from them and learn from it. And it's an untapped area where we can take these different forms of information, whether they come off of surveys or they come off of sentiment analysis or whatever, that feeds into our platform, that enables us to understand what they're looking for and how do we remain engaged with them.
Great, thank you.
We have to be more modern. I mean, it's unfortunately, a lot of this is about digital transformation. And it's not just digital transformation that we're saying, okay, our data's in silos, how do we use all that? That's a big issue, but we have to think beyond that. We have to think about how do we use modern tools to gather data that's behavioral and that gives us insights into what those people want to do and learn post-graduation.
So true. Thank you again, Andy. We're going to wrap up a minute earlier.
Really quick, there's one question just from Mary. I know she put this on chat. I want to make sure we get her in. Andy, any insight in regarding linking data from like Coursera or similar platforms? And she speaks about ASU in Southern New Hampshire. Of course, ASU in Southern New Hampshire is just a tremendous, the approaches that they're taking to really just engage is different than others, right? How does the data from these different platforms around Coursera and other platforms, how does that align with the things that you would have to do to attach it to the student, and then that student's information is coming through that Coursera experience?
Yeah. So, one of the things that we spend a lot of time on is taking that friction of data alignment off the hands of universities. So how do we write algorithms that seek out, how data from one system, from 5, 10 systems, all relate to the same individual, because everything has to be driven to the individual so that we can understand the individual. It all starts with a unique identifier or a map to that allows you to align that information by individual. If I would say one thing that universities, if they really want to understand the individual like I'm describing, or like others that are digitally native and the analytics leaders of the world, you need to be able to have some sort of unique identifier for them. And that's how you do it. Then you can pull it all together. I mean, for us, it's easy. I know everybody out there saying it's not that easy, but when you do it every single day for 6 years, you learn how to do it. So that's that unique identifier.
Great. I know we're over time, but I just wanted to get Mary's question in. Sorry, David. Sorry, David.
All right.
Well, thank you so much. Great to be involved. David, Matt, this has been awesome. So thank you so much for the opportunity.